think that's my cue to start her up.
Okay, and I welcome everybody. I am delighted to be able to introduce to you someone who has a lot of knowledge and has spent many years, well, I don't know, volunteering and professionally. He is, I think, a resident of Alberta a long time, but originally he was born in Winnipeg, I think here. I wrote this down. And it's listed, he's listed as a fifth generation, and I consider myself, that goes way back. I consider I'm second generation because my grandparents came. And even though he's going to talk about years, he hasn't been around that long, but has, I think, a lot of knowledge and a lot to share. He has dedicated a lot of his life to preserving the Ukrainian language, the culture. He tells me that he volunteered for, he's been a volunteer on the Ukrainian Village Board for a long time. And some of you that have been in the museum in Ottawa, I think he was instrumental in taking the church from Smoky Lake, or helping to get it, sort of taking it apart and getting it to Ottawa. And I know when I was there, much to my delight, I could hear the singing of our bishop and the priests that I knew. So we indeed are very lucky to have him with us. And I think in able to cover 130 years, that will take a lot, but I'll ask Radomir to explain how he's going to do that. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the interest and for inviting me to speak today. And I hope that you'll be intrigued by the results or at least benefited from the results. And I'm going to do my presentation as a PowerPoint presentation, perhaps show you some visuals you've never seen before. And because this is an interfaith effort, a good section of my presentation will be on the Ukrainian churches, especially focusing on Alberta. But the general process of immigration is something that I'll be describing that can cover most of Canada, especially for the earliest years, going back to the first year of the 130 years. So I'll now switch over to my presentation. I have to just remember how to do this. So I am sharing my screen. Now I have to.
Yes, and it's visible. Thank you.
Thank you. Good. And I'm imagining, or I was forewarned, that you would like to ask questions at the end. So this year marks the beginning of actually a 2-year commemoration and celebration, because the whole process was divided in two. There was the first year where the very first Ukrainians came to Canada, and there were a whole 2 of them. And one of them stayed, and the other one went back to encourage other people to join them. And they followed in the following spring of 1892. And so this is why it's being commemorated as a 2-stage commemoration, since they occurred over a 2-year period. And the question is, well, why did they even bother to immigrate? Like, what was the reason? First of all, there was a great demand for new blood, for new settlers, for new immigrants in more than one country. There was a demand for immigrants. I wouldn't necessarily call them settlers just because of the way it turned out in South America. There was also a demand in the United States. There was a demand in Canada. And there was a demand in Serbia which was breaking down its estates into smaller areas, smaller landownings, and encouraging people to settle on those smaller landownings, which they did. So those were the four key areas that Ukrainians were attracted to immigrate to. And they were especially attracted because of the state of the economy, the state of the social structure, the political structure where they were living. And where the very first Ukrainians were living was in what was called Austro-Hungary. A whole bunch of states, 10 of them, I believe. And 2 of them were called Galicia, which in Ukrainian is Halachina, and the other one was Bukovina. And these lands were acquired in 1774 with the breakdown of the Polish-Lithuanian monarchy. And were seen as a really good catch because they had so many raw materials to enrich the rest of the empire. But the areas of Bukovina and Galicia were not really expanding economically. They were declining economically. The inflation rate at times was double-digited during the 1890s, and people really wanted to get out. They had finally achieved emancipation from serfdom less than a generation before, in 1848, and the pressure was on to get out because they finally could. The where to, I've already told you. The most unsuccessful, one could say, would be South America because they were being duped in coming there to replace all of the plantation workers who were the original indigenous population who were working the plantations and were fleeing back into the jungle. So Ukrainians thought they were getting a really good deal in going to South America. They came in larger numbers. They formed colonies around these plantations and became disenchanted rather quickly. What had drawn them there was the fact that they were being attracted there with free passage. However, when they said, we want to return, and they were told, well, you can, as soon as you work and pay off the free passage. So they were kind of stuck there for a while. Some eventually did make it out. Some went back to Ukraine. Some came here to Canada, and in fact, some of them even to Alberta. The United States was going strong until all of the Western states were fully settled. And then Canada was a half step behind, so there was still room to come to Canada. And that was the main idea behind why they were being attracted to Canada and to the United States, was not to work existing plantations, but to actually develop farms, to develop the large uninhabited areas of the United States and Canada. And they were doing so with some very good encouragement. So in the 1890s, these little advertisements were being spread by the Canadian government unofficially throughout all of Europe, and they were produced in a variety of languages. This is the Ukrainian version. And of course, being the furthest from the ocean, the Ukrainians were being approached kind of last on the list. They were the easternmost, most extreme population that was being attracted to Canada, with posters that looked almost identical to this one, except in the language where it was being distributed. And the message was the same: 200 million acres under development in Western Canada. For each settler, said the lower right-hand corner. In the upper left-hand corner was what you were being attracted to settle for free. And that was 160 acres, except the acre system was not known in Galicia and Bukovina. So they translated it poorly, as it turns out, to 130 Austrian morgs of free land. So I don't know if this occurred as a result of one of those talking game or telephone game incidents where somebody misheard somebody else. But once we started to analyze, I and some other people involved in the field, this poster, we discovered that it wasn't 130 acres It wasn't 130 Austrian morgues that 160 acres represented. It was 113. So a little bit of a difference in how much, but they didn't care because 113 or 130 Austrian morgues in their eyes made them the equivalent of millionaires. And as I often say, it was like winning the lottery. They were being given land, something they couldn't really do easily in where they were living at the time. And here they were being given land with some provisos. They couldn't turn it over. They couldn't sell it outright. They had to develop it. A lot of it was totally uninhabited sectors of Western Canada. Some of it was treed, some of it was prairie. They liked the treed part because their whole culture was based on wood. And that was again lacking, beginning to really lack in Galicia and Bukovina. So here was this opportunity of coming and inhabiting free treed land. And so people began to write pamphlets encouraging, like travel brochures, go to Canada, go here, go there. You can go to the United States, says this particular pamphlet, but whatever you do, because the word had gotten out by the mid-1890s, don't go to South America, and they even explained why. And they explained the land system of Western Canada. Here's what you get in 160 acres. Another way of looking at it, you get a quarter of a square mile, and you have to settle on that quarter of a square mile, which was a little different from what they were used to. They were in clustered villages, and you could see the next village over the horizon, and they were being moved to an environment that you couldn't see anybody over the horizon. It was just you and your family. And if you settled in the right place, maybe you had a neighbor half a mile away and another neighbor, 3/4 of a mile away. And another neighbor, if all of those black miles called sections were inhabited, that would mean 4 families, 4 whole families. It was not easy to develop a village based on that. So on September 7th, 1891, we had these 2 adventurers who had heard about the system of coming to Canada and getting free land. One of them was named Ivan Pilipiu, and the other was named Vasil Eleniak. And the spellings that you see here are the spellings that were then taken on by them and their descendants in Canada. So they came in 1891. They could get free passage on the railway as part of this unofficial offer. And I say that quite specifically because once these settlers started coming to Canada, Canada realized that they could not be the source of information. It was technically against diplomatic policy to rob any other in Europe, to rob any other country of its labor force. So Canada never did that. And there are very many pieces of literature that unfortunately don't suggest that properly. They say that Canada attracted them. They did not. It was the steamship companies that attracted them. The fact that they were being paid by Canada, of course, is just a minor detail. But Canada did not outright encourage any settlement. So they came out to Winnipeg and they discovered other people from Galicia especially living there already. But they did not recognize themselves as being Ukrainian because they weren't. They came from villages that had been established in Galicia and Bukovina during the Austro-Hungarian years, and they were German speaking. And nonetheless, they all could speak to each other in their various languages. And so they got some advice from shopkeepers in Winnipeg and saying, oh, yes, I have family out near Gretna, Manitoba. You should go see them. They'll tell you what it's like to homestead. There's others of our people out in the Northwest Territories near this town called Edmonton. And you might want to go there because they tell me, I get letters from my son and he thinks the land there is beautiful. You should go there as well. So armed with that information, they went to Gretna. And by this point in time, nobody ever expects in those years to know what the cost of living is. And so they were running out of cash. So the Germans from Galicia who had settled near Gretna offered them jobs, which they took. They tended the stock. More Ileniak than Pilipiu. He was the more adventurous person, and he eventually said, it's September, it's getting cold, let's go see the rest of this land. And they got on the train, and the only train, of course, was the not the Trans-Canada, the Transcontinental. And they went as far as they could on intending to go to Edmonton. And they got as far as Calgary and discovered that the railway line that was being built to Edmonton, as far as a place called Strathcona, was only under construction in 1891. It had not been completed. Wait another month and a half, and you'll be able to go to Strathcona by rail. They didn't have that kind of time, and they began to get scared. They looked around them and they said, where's all this treed land that they said we were going to get? I don't see any trees. Then they got back on the plane, on the train, a little dejected, and went back to Gretna. Then Pilipiu said, nonetheless, it seems like a good deal. I'm going to go back. I'm going to get my family and anybody else who wants to come along. And Ilignac said, no, I'm staying here. I'm going to make money here. And then I'll have something to start my farm with once I once everybody comes and joins us. And so that's what happened. Pilipiu made it back just in time to celebrate the Ukrainian Christmas season in January of 1892, encouraged a whole bunch of people to come with him once he went back in the spring. And then he got put in jail for doing that. Because again, he was causing immigration, and that was frowned upon. And he eventually got out of jail. But by that point in time, he had done such a good job of convincing some of his fellow villagers to go. They decided they couldn't wait for him. He had no money left anyways after the court case. And so they left without him in late April, early May of 1892. And they went to Winnipeg, and they intended to come all the way to this Edmonton place, but suddenly discovered that they couldn't because one of the women was about to give birth. And so she couldn't go on. Her husband said, I'm not going. And the other men only went on to Edmonton, actually to Strathcona, crossed the river, then looked for some land that was available from the people at the land office, and got as far as this place called Fort Saskatchewan. And just near Fort Saskatchewan were some available lands. And so they went and took out, so they were very happy. They took out entry on those lands, intending to work them. And then the seasons began to change, and this was already July. And they said, oh man, did we make a mistake? It's July. How are we going to get any crops? What are we going to live off of? And so they were very terrified that they had made this mistake that was not reversible. But the land agent gave them a letter, said, no, you are allowed to abandon land, and you can go back to Winnipeg. You can find land still again, wherever you want. And you can come back here or settle in Manitoba. We don't care, just take some homestead land and develop Western Canada. So most of them did, except for two. And they were known as Anton Paish and Nikola Tichkovsky, and they stayed behind and took out homesteads. Technically, they were the very first two settlers. And in the following spring, they were joined by a new group in 1893. But the others who went back to Winnipeg, some of them stayed behind and stayed in Winnipeg. Mrs. Yatsu did give birth to the first Ukrainian Canadian, which would make him a second generation. But just in terms of even the introduction that Virginia gave, there's always a mix-up in what you call yourself generation-wise. So I called myself fifth generation because my great-great-grandparents came to Canada. They came to Canada with my great-grandfather, but he was not an adult. He was not the person who received citizenship, and he was 5 years old. So he couldn't do anything legal, and therefore, in my opinion, I count from my great-great-grandfather, and therefore that makes me fifth generation and my grandchildren seventh generation. But back to the story. So here are some posters published in Ukrainian and Ukrainian of the time and distributed throughout Galicia and Bukovina, encouraging people to come to Canada, and where their offices were set up in Lviv, Ternopil, Chernivtsi, that would get them tickets all the way to wherever they wanted to go in Canada. All you had to do was get travel papers, not really a passport, but travel papers to go, to leave your village. And they were called Schiefkarte. And as travel agents often do, they even had special little pouches that you could put your travel papers into so you wouldn't lose them, any official documents. So here's an example of one. I've already told you about the first settlers. This is the ship that they came on, the Numidian. And this is typical scenes at that time of what you would see on these ships. And you were very often, if you wanted to afford to come to Canada, you were put in a special class of ship in the lower sections of the ship, which were called steerage. And what you really were was ballast when you were in steerage, because that space, when those ships returned to Europe, were either empty or they had to be full of something to act as ballast. They didn't use stones. They used things that were required in Europe. And the easiest thing they could fill those spaces with were cattle or steers. And they were known as, that area was known as steerage. They did not have to walk among those beds. Those beds were removable. And you reinstalled them once you started to take on passengers again in Europe. Here's one of the reasons why people of Ukrainian descent can't figure out if they're Polish, if they're Ukrainian, what they are, how to spell their names in English, because they sound different in Ukrainian. And that's the fact that their travel papers were issued in 2 languages and not the Cyrillic language, the Cyrillic alphabet that they were used to. They were issued in German and in Polish. And the administration was greatly, at that time in Galicia especially, was greatly operated by the Poles. So the spellings of names that were put into these passports, into these travel papers, were the spellings the way those names would be written in Polish. And there is a difference. So that's why Ivan Pilipiu, IW, came and retained, I guess this is the way they spell my name in English, and his name to this very day by his descendants is spelled OW. Here is the first page. It describes the immigrant. On the second page, his chattel, his property, meaning his wife and his children, and described in biometric form their hair coloring and everything else, but there were no photographs. The last page was most important. It had to be signed and stamped by the administration of your village, allowing you to leave the village and even identifying where you might be going to if you're new and for how long you were being allowed to go for. And generally, you were being given those documents for a 1-year period. And you came to Canada and you got off the boat and you waited for the train and you brought whatever you could with you, but even that was expensive. So here's a bit of advice from somebody who wrote one of those travel brochures saying, anything you can carry or wear on your back, doesn't matter how many layers, do it that way. It's expensive to come out there, and you're actually limited in what you could bring. You could bring a trunk 2.5 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 2 feet high per person. That was the key. If you came out with a family, you were a little better off. So these are the happy immigrants about to go inland in Canada and develop a new life here. But they came the way that they were used to every day in Galician Bukovina, in their normal everyday dress. These were not dancers. And of course, that was a little bit different part of the Canadian landscape all of a sudden, buying provisions to go out to Western Canada at the railway station. If you compare these guys to the guy in the bowler hat and suit and 3-piece suit in the background, yeah, it was quite a contrast. Everything these people did was quite a contrast. The way they spoke, the way they worshipped, all of the food that they ate, these were all new to Canada. And so nonetheless, there was a little bit of uneasiness, even suspicion over what these people were all about. You know, they walked around barefoot, like who does that? They dressed very funny, because funny means not the way I do. They had their own separate times for rest stops. There were rest stops when the train had to stop, where those people got to rest and stretch their legs. and they got to be ogled by those people from the inside of the boxcars, looking at this strange wonder. There were also organized moves later on. Here's a man who was greatly influential in getting more Ukrainians out to Canada by the hundreds, and came to Canada in 1895 and came back very well informed. The Canadian government really didn't treat him seriously, thinking, surely this guy isn't real. He's not going to convince people to come out to Canada in droves. He nonetheless wrote this pamphlet and sent the Canadian government, which had changed by that point in time, a letter in March of 1896. And suddenly they said, oh my gosh, they're coming. 50 families, he says. And things changed then too. They came on the SS Christiana. One thing you notice about these is they weren't highly powered ships. One chimney, two chimneyed, not like that super cruiser, the Titanic. But if you got onto a ship with four, they thought, that was the legend, if you managed to get onto a ship with 4 stacks, that was good, but not for the people on the Titanic. And then later on, regimes changed after World War II, World War I, and you had a different type of passport distributed in even more languages. One of them was Romanian for Bukovina, and using the White Star Line. But it was possible for those people who had come earlier to sponsor relatives in. And here's an example of what you had to fill out to promise that you will not make this relative of yours an encumbrance upon the state, that you will not only sponsor them to get here, you will support them and even provide proof of how you could do so. And so eventually this developed into a society, the St. Raphael Society. It was all over Western Canada. And I hope I don't have a technical difficulty here. I'm sorry. So here you can see some of the places in Alberta where there were agents of the St. Raphael Society, because you didn't necessarily have to sponsor a relative to Canada. You could sponsor anyone else who was willing to come to Canada. And it wasn't like South America where it was a secret, but it was very open. I will sponsor you to Canada. You will live with me on my farm, and you will be my hired hand. And the first of your wages will go towards working off the cost of the ticket, whatever it cost me. After that, you're free to stay, you're free to move on, you're free to go back. So that was the 1920s. Even the Cunard Line was involved. And the Canadian Pacific, this is their office in Ternopil. And they even had their own little pockets for the shifkarte, for the ship's cards. White Star Line even issued little souvenir calendars, wallet calendars, advertising their services, and all in Ukrainian. So eventually the Ukrainians occupied the whole parkland tree belt of Western Canada. And the largest and the oldest of those colonies was the one east of Edmonton, became known as the Star Colony, later Edna. It was renamed, the post office was renamed to Edna. But territorially, it was the oldest and the largest colony of Ukrainians beyond Ukraine. So now I see I've been talking so much, I'm running out of time. So I will increase the speed of these slides. This is just to show you how many people were coming in. That yellow square, known as a township, was 36 square miles. They came in 1893 in groups. By 1895, they had occupied one whole township, 36 square miles. Then in 1896, they had expanded 5-6 times more. By 1903, they had gotten all the way to what became Two Hills on the railway. That railway didn't exist yet, but as far as Lavoie, or future Lavoie, because that existed a couple of years later. In other words, they weren't taking the railway because it wasn't there. They were the only group that was expanding from west to east, not from east to west, coming from Calgary northward. By 1904, 1 year difference, you can see that they've crossed the river. And so on. So back to what I said I would do is I would cover churches a little bit and just give you some of the details. This was not a type of church, again, that was known in Canada, although the Roman Catholic Church thought it was, because there were Ukrainian Catholics in Ukraine and there were Ukrainian Orthodox in Ukraine, and they all followed something called the Eastern Rite, not the Western Rite Christianity, but the Eastern Rite. And they had differences in their services, in the church language, and even what their churches looked like. So the churches had three basic sectors. You entered the church through a chamber called the narthex. You came into the main chamber of worshipers, which was called the nave, with a big dome on top at minimum. And then where the priest conducted the services, where the altar was, called the sanctuary, which was an exclusive place for the priest and his assistants. So in the towns, and especially in the cities of Ukraine, all of Ukraine, you would find architecture like this, and it reflected the origins of the Eastern Rite, which was Greece. And Greece was heavy into stone architecture. There wasn't a lot of stone to be dealt with, especially in Galicia and Bukovina, so they had to adapt that to a wooden style. They followed and decorated the interiors of their churches with the major feasts of their Eastern Rite calendar. And here you can see depictions of them. They weren't illustrations that you just thought up. There was a recipe, if you want, to how Christ was depicted, which poses, which colors, how Mary was depicted. And so these are the major feasts that celebrate Mary and celebrate Jesus Christ. And that eventually, in the old country context, took you to an interior of a church that looked like this. To divide the sanctuary from the worshipers, a screen was put across called an iconostas, full of icons, full of those feasts. So you could have a church as simple looking as this one, kind of satisfying the basic requirements of what it took to have a Ukrainian, structurally to have a Ukrainian Eastern Rite church. And then you could have them looking like this, with even more domes, higher and higher to the sky, because when you were on the interior of these buildings, the ceiling would be blue, there would be stars on it, because you were worshiping up to God and high in the firmaments. And there was usually an icon that in the highest dome looking down at you, and it was Jesus Christ or the Trinity looking down on the worshipers in that particular church. This is one that mimics that was built right after independence was being announced in present-day Ukraine, still following that style. Here is one that is in our own Edmonton, which was also trying to be as particular as possible in its interpretation of the architecture, even mimicking a particular church in Ukraine that was 800, I believe, years old. However, in the countryside, you had much smaller churches that described the limitations of people and how they knew how to actually build these churches, but they reflected their origins. So I can tell you, and you'll have to believe me, that this is a church from Bukovina. It is the Bukovinian style of church. And these churches were being built faster than priests could come, and they were being used or services conducted on a civic level by people even before they were finished. And that's not where I wanted to go. But maybe it's a signal. So as I was saying, they were being used, and this is the Easter service. The church isn't even finished, but we have to celebrate Easter. Priests are coming. They told us they're coming, but we were busy. And this is what they look like on the interior. As long as we have a shelter, a roof over it, we'll put the necessary things in place on this interior, and we're going to start having services. We'll even mimic the architecture of our homeland in Canada. But instead of wood, we can buy brick now. We will make it out of brick. And our cemeteries are going to look just the way they did, with all of the feet of the people facing east because that is the direction of paradise in our church belief. And so with the last reckoning, we will spring out of our graves as the scriptures go, and we will make our way to paradise. And we will repeat, except we don't have to make wooden crosses anymore. There's this great stuff called cement, but we will repeat the particular design work of the crosses and celebrate the celebrations the way we did in the old country. All the way to the 1960s, and everything was vibrant and fervent, and churches were getting larger and larger, and the iconography was getting richer and richer, and styles were changing even. And nonetheless, this was still in the midst of the pioneering efforts of the churches. And then there's certain things started to happen. We started to get new words in our vocabulary: liability, viability, vandalism, decommission, dispose, memorialize. And where are those cemeteries? Where are our unmarked graves? Because this was happening. Churches, as people moved into the cities, they were being abandoned. Eventually, people had to step in and, in a very crude fashion at first, demolish them. And that is against the teachings of the church to do so in this fashion. And they actually are supposed to be burned. So here you see a church that had barely gotten to its 50th anniversary. And here you see those same steps on the right-hand side once the church was disposed of, because the church was vacant. It was not being used. What to do? You memorialize them. You put churches in museums, but you try and make sure that they're still living churches. So this church from Barrich, Alberta, near Smoky Lake, this is what it looked like in 1923. This is what it looked like in 1953. It kept on developing. This is how large the property continued to expand. But in 1964, there was nobody really left to do that. There was already a church in town in Smoky Lake. What to do? Well, we're not going to abandon our cemetery, but we can't bring ourselves to really get rid of the church. And so sometimes what they would do when they couldn't bring themselves to get rid of the church, they kept it, let it stay there. We'll build a new one in front of it. And eventually things like the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village were formed, and people would come along and say, if you're not doing anything with that church, we'd like to do something with it for you. And that's how this got then transferred to the church in Barrich. This is the last service in that church. And this is what it looked like once that church was in the museum, inside the Museum of Civilization in in Quebec. And there were certain agreements at that time to keep that church alive, to make sure that services are being still held in it. Even the parishioners sometimes come out or have come out to ensure that those services are being celebrated. And this is the very last major service held in that church once it was relocated within the renovated Museum of Civilization only 4 years ago. And this is the last wedding held in that church. And I hope that I have not taken over on my time too much, but I am ready to field any questions that you might have. I see lips moving, but I think some of you still have to turn on your microphones.
Virginia, you're in charge.
Oh, well, if anyone else has a question, but I just wonder if you could comment about Ukrainians with Indigenous people, what that was like in early days.
It was, from the work that I've done, even including the Barrich Church, so I can give you a very vivid example from the Barrich Church history, is I got to interview someone who was a child when that church was being built. Even before the church was built, they were already settling on the land. Once they had crossed the river, as I pointed out on that map, after it was surveyed in 1903, they began to cross the river and take up land. And so they would follow trails. They would follow the Victoria Trail, the old Buffalo Trail that became called the Victoria Trail. They became aware of Fort Victoria. And they began to establish their homesteads first and foremost, but they did so with a little bit of ignorance. They were going through what they thought was uncharted land, at least it looked that way on the land titles maps, where there's some trails. And they would follow and look for the stakes and set up homesteads using the grid system developed for them as part of the homestead system. So this particular woman recounted to me how her father had gone off to earn money in the mines in southern Alberta, as was often the case, and left behind a family. He had already built a house for them, and it was really something that was easy for them to do. They found a clearing in the forest, and it was even off one of the trails that they had followed all the way up from the river, from Pecan. And it was next to a valley. It was beautiful land. There was a river nearby, a nice source of natural water. It was perfect for homesteading. So he built the home. Then he went to the mines. And one day in the fall, they were in the house having supper, the mother and the children, and they could hear noises outside. So they looked out the window, and it was a group of men on horseback, kind of looking at this house. And so they eventually ignored it, and they went into the brush alongside and pulled out these poles, because the clearing was actually a stopping place for them during their hunting season. And they would work their way northward, way north of where Smoky Lake is now, to do their hunting. And this was one of their spots that they had developed. So the women felt rather terrified to see these people here. She didn't know what to expect of them. And she did something that is common to very many cultures, and definitely prevalent in Ukrainian culture. You can't really go to a place and enter a home with something just really that you have to discuss with them, without, first of all, that person inviting you into their home, and that is done through food. And people are, they undergo a ceremony, a very quiet ceremony that people themselves of Ukrainian descent don't always realize they're doing. And in being hospitable and serving food, they are starting the meeting. And the agenda after that is, so why have you come? And those of you who know that ceremony, you don't wait for why have you come. You've had a little bit to eat, and then you should be discussing something else, business. And so what she did, they were there, she was there, and she pulled together a meal and she took it to them to serve them. And they, in return, after a couple of minutes, knocked on her door and presented her with a blanket, which is also a ceremony in their culture. This is something that repeated itself many times, that you can find recorded in some of the local histories that were being written in the 1980s. Smoky Lake comes to mind, the Smoky Lake history comes to mind, where there are reminiscences like that woman's reminiscence of people who came there as settlers. They were the children of the first settlers, and they had memories that were included how the indigenous people interacted with the Ukrainian settlers. And it was very, very well. And there was this tradition that has been documented even in that Smoky Lake history. People would travel up and down that Victoria Trail, the North Victoria Trail, because there is a South Victoria Trail as well. And they were traveling usually back and forth, and their travels included the Saddle Lake Reserve, the Saddle Lake Reservation. And they would stop for the night on their travels. And of course, it was always going to be near a homestead. And they would come to the door and they would be fed by the Ukrainian settlers. And they would move on the next day and continue their travel. There was no question of, it wasn't so that nobody gets the wrong impression, it wasn't any form of begging. It was simply, you're here, we're here. They got to know each other quite well. I remember one gentleman who was a colleague of mine at the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village talking about his mother. and his mother eventually smoked, which for a Ukrainian woman was not really the norm, but she smoked because she had one of the indigenous women in the neighborhood come over and learn from her how to weave. And she taught her things, and she taught her how to smoke because that was her norm. Her norm is, when we're doing this type of thing, I smoke. And I guess you should smoke too. So there are, more humorous versions of that. The Andrew local history, now that I'm thinking in that direction, the Andrew local history has a very good description of the local settlement of indigenous peoples around there, how some of the Métis eventually took up homesteads, as they did also north of the river, where their cemeteries are, and remain to this day. So I would say the shorter answer to your question would be they got along, in my opinion, quite well. If you go into the reserve, to the local cemetery there, you will find in Cyrillic, you will find the graves of people of Ukrainian descent, if not the original settlers themselves. And during the flu epidemic, the indigenous people, even risking their own lives, visited some of the people who were sick and took their children as the people were dying, in some cases adopted them. One of the chiefs of the Saddle Lake Indian Reservation, I believe it was in the 1970s, was at least partially of Ukrainian descent, the chief. So I know that there has been a lot of play on this indigenous and having to work out, a good relationship with the indigenous, but I think I can counter by saying it's existed for quite a long time. Yes, there has been movements of population, the Ukrainian population, the Métis population that was largely around Edmond, eventually moved away. They, as the Ukrainians often did in more to the west around Edmonton, if they took up a farm and they were the only Ukrainian around, they wanted to be with people of their own kind. It was easier to coexist. It was easier to develop. And then there's an abandonment document that I found for Warspite near Barrich. And it was an abandoned document, and his reason for wanting to abandon his land used the phrase, "I am surrounded by Galicians." And he just wanted to leave, and they said, okay, approved. And so that was his choice. So there was indigenous, Ukrainian, non-Ukrainian. I think that people definitely had their differences. It took a while to get used to each other. Intolerance is always, everywhere, all of the time. And you can read plenty of intolerance towards the Ukrainian settlers in the Vegreville Observer during the interwar period. And they were very open in their criticism and used whatever language they wanted at that time because they ran their newspaper, those people. And the Ukrainians got to sit and bear it. During the war, when the War Measures Act was enacted, they got to see what it was like, what their ancestors felt like during serfdom before emancipation, because they had to report to the policemen. They had to present the galleys of their newspapers for approval by the policemen. The newspapers, after a while, had to be bilingual, and all kinds of other little examples of things we don't do anymore or shouldn't do ever.
Oh, thank you very much. Does anyone else, if you have a question, just raise your hand and unmute yourself and go ahead.
I've just got a brief anecdote that I can share, and that comes from my wife's family. Her grandfather hiked with some other folks all the way up to the Yukon during the gold rush era. And on the way up and on the way down, the way they survived was by stopping in and getting food and assistance from the various tribes all along the way. And they seemed to get along pretty good. And they found them quite helpful in that regard. I don't know any more specifics other than that. I just remember that shared with me quite some time ago. And it was very nice to see the St. Onufri's church there. I served as an altar boy there as a kid, and I remember it well.
I recognize the surname. And if you aren't aware, there's a photograph of your family in the Provincial Archives of Alberta in the Gavinsha collection.
Oh, no, I wasn't, but
About
it's good.
1948, I think it was.
Wow.
I have a story too, if I may. My mother's parents were Norwegian, and they came in 1895 to a Norwegian colony, I guess, near Camrose. In fact, David Goa's family is from there. Many of you know David. And in 1895, apparently it was 60 below in the winter. It was just a horrible, horrible winter. And it does not get that cold in Norway. It just doesn't. So they actually left, and they went down to near Portland, Oregon, to Clackamas County, in fact, and they homesteaded there, but there was not the free land that the Dominion of Canada had offered them, because Alberta didn't exist yet. But my grandmother stayed, because by then she'd fallen in love with my grandfather. And yes, they lived in Strathcona, in Garno, in fact, and they remembered the train stop there, and once a week or so that the Ukrainians would get off with their sheepskins and so on. And it was an entertainment in a way, because there wasn't much entertainment at that time in Strathcona. So that's my story. Thank you.
I got a question. I put it in the chat actually, but I was just wondering if there's any information on how the towns in that area got their names, such as Lamont and Chipman and Smoky Lake.
Oh, yes. The easiest one to give it as an example is actually the Grand Trunk Pacific line, which goes through Tofield and all the way to the mountains. And that particular line was built in 1908, I believe. And they had a very simple solution for keeping some order to their system, because the railways like to be very ordered. Every town had to look the same. Here's a map. Here's where the stop's going to be, and we got to name it. Well, eventually their system became, it has to go in alphabetical order. And when you come to Z, and there aren't all that many names beginning in Z, well, then you jumped over to A and kept on going. So if you go back to the map now and you look at what's left of that railway line and the towns on it, you can see that there is a progression of the alphabet all the way to the mountains. The Canadian Northern Railway, the one that goes Vegreville, Lamont, and Mundare, was varied. And Lavoie was he had a stopping point when there was still the Victoria Trail that traveled from Fort Saskatchewan through what became Lamont, went around Beaver Hill Lake, and a major stopping point, because I think that was one day's travel, was where Lavoie had his stopping house, and you could stay the night there. So they named it after him. Manville and Minburn, the name of the company that was developing that particular line was Mackenzie and Mann. Mackenzie and Mann had run out of money just after Minburn. And there they were stuck. The rail went as far as it could. The tracks went as far as they could. The railway bed just ended. It was like a cliff. And so Mackenzie went back to Ottawa to wheedle some more money out of people. And it took him a while. And in the meantime, Faithful Man stayed there at that site. And so his reward for doing so, the expression of thanks was they named Manville after Mr. Mann. Vegreville was named after a Roman Catholic missionary who operated a mission about 4 or 5 miles south of the present town of Vegreville. There's even a cairn in the middle of a farmer's field talking about the original location of Vegreville. Because once people knew that Vegreville was coming through, they thought, well, we'll get ready. We'll get ready for the railway. And in fact, instead of buying land from the railway all the time in these lots in the railway towns, we'll make our own town. And they hadn't checked with the people to the east of them who had tried the same thing. And so what the railway would simply do is they would establish their rail line nearby. And they would name it the same as the original town. They would ensure that the post office would be transferred to their location on their railway line. And so the people at Vegreville realized that they weren't going to win this battle. And in the winter of 1904, 05, or 03, 04, During the coldest part of the winter, they took up all of their buildings, got a whole bunch of telephone pole-sized beams and rolled them across to their new location in the town, which they had to buy the lots for. Mundare was named after the station master, Joe Mundare. Lamont was, I believe, and Hilliard were named after politicians. Fort Saskatchewan, of course, was a fort. Smoky Lake was originally named by the indigenous. They called the nearby lake Smoke Lake. And so eventually when the railway came through, they named it Smoky Lake, but they spelled it S-M-O-K-E-Y. Today it's S-M-O-K-Y. Belis is actually one of the few Ukrainian named towns. And Ukrainians they didn't have signposts in these villages. They had descriptives. So if you wanted to get somewhere and you were being given directions, that's the only way you could get around. So you go down to the end of this road and you take a turn at Ivan's cross, because he's erected a memorial cross. So, you know, you take a left turn there and then you go for a while and then you'll see Stefan's Hill. And so then you take the turn there at Stefan's Hill and you go on further. And so sectors of a village had names and people who lived there knew them and they used those. And I did find evidence of that actually south of Smoky Lake, where certain roads were being given names even by the non-Ukrainians. And they were not the official names of township and range road such and such. So that the place where Belis is, the town of Belis, not where it used to be, just to the north where they thought, oh, we'll get ready for the railway. What happened there was it had a lot of white poplar growing. There were just forests and forests of white poplar. And instead of calling it the poplar forest, they called it the place where the white forest is, Tam de Bilalis. And Tam de is simply is repetitive and says, and it's the place where. So people after a while just called it Bilis. And then the non-Ukrainians came by and they said, well, what do you call this place? And they said, Bilis. Now there is a totally different version of where that name came from by a non-Ukrainian source. And so it was named after them. So the Ukrainians had their reason for what they think was the name, and the non-Ukrainians had their reasons for what was the name. Vilna was a combination, and it indicates where the Ukrainian sector of the settlement began to peter out and blend into a Polish sector. So what they had as a common name and common experience was the fact that they were free of all the burdens that they had in the old country. And Vilna or Vilne means free, and so on. There's actually a book on geographic place names published once in the 1930s, I believe, and in the 1980s that you can still find.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. What a memory you've got. I envy you.
I was paid to have a memory for 43 years.
I have learned so much. And on behalf of all of us here, I think I could listen to you for a lot longer, and it is 1 o'clock. It's amazing the detail and the history that you have shared with us. I feel very much enriched, and it's sort of inspired me maybe to think a little bit more about my ancestors and what a treasure your family has, and what a treasure our community has, our Ukrainian community. And I know you've received some awards, Hetman Award, Leadership Award, and deservedly so. But please, on behalf of all of us, know that you've enriched us very much by what you've told us. And thank you so much. And I hope you continue to do this. I know a lot of what you do is volunteerism, and you have shown us the love for your ancestry and for Ukrainians. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you.
Pleased to do so.
And Netta has a message about our calendar, I think.
If I will just, may I have to do my usual ending too. Thank you. Thank you all. That was fantastic, Radomir. It was fascinating. And and inspiring. We are about half of you here are members. For those of you who came in late, we will be putting this talk with Radomir's position on our website. I put our email address into the chat. I have two things to tell you. If you want to get on our emailing list, please just email me at the office. And also, we sell a calendar every year. It's a beautiful multi-faith calendar. It has all the major and minor holidays, feasts and fasts of 13 different faiths. It's a Canadian product from Vancouver with original Canadian artwork. It costs $16 and it is a wealth of information for everybody who would find something interesting in it. And I see one more question down there in the chat. And Guy and I think we have time. If anybody has to leave, they certainly can. But I can stay if you let Radomir, if you have time to answer that question, perhaps. It's up to you, of course.
Internment camps? Oh yes, and I alluded to that when I was talking about the restrictions that were being put on the population of Ukrainian descent during the war, once the War Measures Act was enacted at that time. It was an era of paranoia, and it hit the people of Ukrainian descent the worst, because there was still a lack of knowledge of who they were, what they represented, and so that created a mistrust. So I, for example, personally can give you a version of that kind of environment, which was happening at the very same time that the camps were being formed as a way of dealing with this problem. The Ukrainians didn't know they were a problem. But my grandfather, once he came to Canada alone to get a farmstead, got a homestead, but decided he really wanted to have what he couldn't get as easily in the old country, and that was an education. And he especially wanted to work it within his ancestry. And there was a thing at that time called the Ruthenian Teacher Training College at Brandon, at what is now the university. There were similar schools in Regina. Interestingly, there was no such school in Alberta. Alberta was, of the three prairie provinces, probably the most intolerant of ethnicity. So he enrolled in that college, and once he finished it, once he graduated, it was 1915. He was in the last graduating class, and full of vim and vigor to go out there and carry on the role of a teacher, especially in the Ukrainian colony areas, because they had even taken the Alexandria Reader and fully reproduced it, taken out the English language pages and replaced the text with Ukrainian. So you could actually do the Canadian curriculum in a mixture of English and Ukrainian, with the idea that you were assisting these immigrants integrate into Canadian society. But by 1915, those feelings had changed, and suddenly, full of vim and vigor, his school was abolished. He could still get, and he still get, along with his fellow graduates of his year and previous years, he could still get teaching jobs, especially in the Ukrainian settlement areas, but not further beyond very often. And so they took advantage of that. So the Ukrainians had Ukrainian language newspapers, and they would advertise for teachers in their school districts, and did so in Ukrainian, where they also said, and by the way, we're not just advertising to have you teach in our school, but you're going to have to run the program in our local hall. And since we can't do it legally in the fashion that we were used to with a bilingual program, we will make do the way we got to do in the old country. So their way of making do is the Ukrainian teachers who got hired in these settlements would end their school day about 3:30, according to regulation. Everybody would pack up their textbooks, reach into their desk, and pull out their Ukrainian textbooks. And that was the beginning of what became known as Ukrainian school. And that's where you got to retain your Ukrainian language, ability to write, ability to read. And if you went to the hall, you got to know about Ukrainian literature, do plays that reflected that literature and history, and so many other activities. In Alberta, once you came off the farm to get an even higher education, there were things there were dormitories organized for you, but they were more than dormitories. One was the Shevchenko Institute, the other one was St. John's Institute, and they offered to lodging, room and board to these Ukrainian language students, and some people could get their children into those institutions by paying with farm produce, which then was recycled into the meals for their students that day. But in the evenings, not only did you have homework from school, but you were expected to get involved in the drama group and all those other things that gave you a Ukrainian knowledge, a Ukrainian Canadian knowledge. And once you graduated from school, many of those people went back to their original locations or to neighboring locations and passed on that new knowledge through the hall, through the school, to other generations. So that that was all going on, not in defiance, but in making do. If you were suddenly sent to one of these camps that was set up to deal with the problem, you were sometimes there only because you didn't have a Canadian passport. And that's because you couldn't get one in time, because of course everything shut down and no people were being allowed in from Austria-Hungary after 1914. The door slammed shut. And there were people who had come in 1914, 13, 11, and you couldn't get a Canadian, well, not citizenship, but naturalization at that time without showing a little bit of proof that you were serious in wanting to do so. And the minimum requirement for that was being a resident of Canada for 3 years. You couldn't own land and get final title for it unless you had naturalization. So you could get a homestead prior to 1914, work it, but the third question on the list, granting title, was, are you a naturalized British subject? And if you said no, you got to get your title in 1921, 1922, if you could be that patient. So in the meantime, these men who did not have the right passport, had perhaps a jealous neighbor who reported them to the police as a big bad alien, were sent to what were considered to be work camps. But they were criticized by the International Tribunal, Canada was, for transforming those internment camps into slave labor camps. And the ones in southern Alberta got to build what is now known as the Old Highway to Banff. They were set up in these camps in very crude conditions. They had to build their own lodgings, and they got paid a pittance. They felt that they were in a prisoner of war camp. And they were not in war, but they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, had the wrong passport when somebody decided to make an issue of it. And so they developed the town of Banff. They planted all the nice trees that you see in Banff today. They did everything that was against the rules of internment camps worldwide. And you could not necessarily get out immediately after the war ended. Those internment camps continued on for a while yet. So it was really, and there is a whole commission now set up. Finally, it took only nearly 100 years, but finally there is a commission set up dedicated to really, maybe the correct word is exposing these internment camps for what they were, getting that knowledge into school curriculums. There is a website devoted to that. And, there are people who came out of those camps feeling like criminals. They had no idea what they did wrong. They just knew that if they'd been in prison, they must be a criminal. They never even shared that knowledge of what had happened. What did you do during the war, Daddy, as that film went? Well, that's what they did during the war. They were a criminal. They were behind barbed wire. They never even shared that knowledge with their descendants. Some descendants are only beginning to find out now through this commission's work of identifying individuals who were in that camp, in those camps, because they were all across Western Canada. They were in Quebec, they were in Ontario. and the bulk of the populations of those camps were of Ukrainian descent. So that it's only now that that story is really coming out. I have a colleague named Peter Melnitsky, and we had come across, we both are also involved in, and have always been involved in an interest in Ukrainian studies or Ukrainian Canadian history. And he wrote an article that was published in 1974 that shared at a scholarly conference what he had found to date on that. And it was great. It was a pioneering effort. It was taken up by others after him. But in doing the training, for example, of the guides at the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village, which was a university course that was at one time open to anyone, I covered that in one of my lectures because guides may be asked, just like they're asking today, they may be asked about, so tell me about this internment stuff. And this was still the 1990s, and less was known. So instead of waiting for that, I made it part of the lectures so that they would be knowledgeable in whatever was known at that time. So I gave all of that lecture, and I asked then, are there any questions? And a not university age, maybe a little older woman held up her hand and for a question, and so I asked yes, and she said, I don't believe you. And people didn't. It was just a bad legend. It's like the Holocaust. It's like, you know, the famine in Ukraine. There is a sector of the society that can't believe that Canada would be able to officially conduct itself in this way. And these are recurring waves, and we are undergoing a wave now involving our Indigenous population. But those other waves have not ceased as well, you know, and one of the things that I was involved with most recently, I think not Virginia, but the other woman from had referred to was the issue of working with the United Church and cemeteries. So what we did, our project did, is over a 7-year period, 7-year period, is we identified the location of and visited and photographed every single headstone that was still standing in 140 cemeteries. And those are now online because we would field questions sometimes. A man phoned me from Newark, New Jersey. He said, I heard that my uncle went to this place called Smoky Lake. We don't know what happened to him. We know that you're doing cemeteries now. Can you tell us where he's buried at least? And it was all online by that point, and it's done alphabetically in one spot. And I said, yeah, I can. Do you want to know the information? And I gave it to him over the phone. And he thanked me very much. He says, because I'm too old, I'll never make it to this place, but at least I know. And I said, would you like a photograph? And I sent it to him by email. And that he found very rewarding. But there are still many cemeteries out there, Ukrainian and non-Ukrainian alike, that have lost graves. Many people, if a child died in childbirth or in infancy, they did not erect a monument to their children. The unbaptized children were buried in a different part of the cemetery from the baptized people of that parish. So those are now being identified also and marked in some cemeteries where there is still someone left in a community because, you know, there's the viability and there's churches are shutting down, they're being disposed of, the cemetery is left behind, but there's no one there to tend them, and they eventually fall into disrepair. I drove past one cemetery 5 times one day because I didn't think that farmer's field contained a cemetery. The crop was so high, you couldn't see a single cross. And half the crosses, as it was in that cemetery, were the traditional wooden ones that had fallen over. So it took a whippersnapper and to even discover what that cemetery was all about. And that is the reality after 130 years.
This has been so marvelous, and I'm afraid I have to leave. There might be other people, as I said, we could listen forever, but I wonder, could you perhaps, if there are some questions yet or something that people want to know, we in the Interfaith Center would be delighted if you decided to join our center. But if there are any people that want questions, maybe they can email the Interfaith Center and those questions, or requests for information. Maybe it sounds like you have a lot of networking. There are lots of presentations that you've done. We would welcome any time if you would like us to advertise that, if you want to get the information to us. And as again, it's unfortunate. I have to leave, but I want to thank you. And we hope we can maintain a relationship with you and you with us to get this information out. It's just been a delightful presentation. Thank you.
Absolutely,
you.
I agree, and I'd be happy to be the messenger for anybody. And some people don't know how to use the chat, so perhaps Virginia, if there's anybody you know on here that wants the email address of the Interfaith Center, you could at your convenience send it to them, because some people don't
okay.
know about the chat. Yeah. So thank
Okay.
you.
There are even materials that come to mind because we have just finished celebrating that September 7th first in the place where it all started, in Lamont County, where the Star Colony started. And that was done online with a ceremony that twinned the originating village of Nabilu with Lamont County, because as much as it's been known for 130 years, that legend, that story, and a lot of it is legend, unfortunately, a little bit weak on fact. There has never been an official acknowledgement between those two locations. So now they have a twinning ceremony, and they plan to celebrate next year the actual settlement even better and bigger and better than what they did this year, which was limited by COVID. But there are a lot of links leading up to that ceremony that I could send you. Some of them are simply newspaper articles from the Lamont paper, from the Vegreville paper, that have some background information that may help you. It has more detail than what I was able to give today. So I can send you links definitely to some of your questions. And if you want more after that, then I'll even entertain more.